My landlord's daughter showed up to fix my sink. I want to be clear that this was not a romantic setup. The sink had been dripping for 11 days. I had left 2 messages with the building management office. And on a Saturday morning in March, a knock came at my door, and when I opened it, there was a woman standing in the hallway with a toolbox and a slightly apologetic expression, and she said, "Hi, I'm Layla. I handle maintenance for my dad's properties." The toolbox was real, and the work order she had printed out was real, and the way she looked at my sink for the first 30 seconds after I showed it to her was the look of someone who already knew what was wrong with it. None of this was a romantic setup. It was a leaky faucet and a landlord who apparently had his daughter do his maintenance calls, which was either a family business arrangement or evidence of something I was not there to evaluate. I am 31 years old, and I teach high school history, which means I spend most of my professional life in rooms where I am supposed to be the authority, and most of my personal life in an apartment where the faucet drips and I have not fixed it. I moved into this apartment 14 months ago, after the end of a long relationship that had taken up several years and had ended with the specific exhaustion of 2 people who had been together long enough that they no longer surprised each other and had confused the absence of surprise with the absence of feeling. I had moved into the apartment because it was in a good school district, and because it was quiet, and because the rent was within my budget, which is not a romantic way to choose a home, but is how most people who teach high school choose a home. I had not particularly thought about who owned the building, or what their family situation was, or whether they had a daughter who handled maintenance. Layla fixed the sink in 23 minutes. She had the right part with her, which told me she had looked at the work order before she came and diagnosed the problem before she arrived, which was the kind of professional competence that I found immediately impressive, and said nothing about, because it seemed like a strange thing to compliment someone for while they were lying on the floor under your sink. She worked in the specific quiet of someone who does not need to narrate what they are doing because they know what they are doing, and I made coffee and offered her some, and she said yes, black, without looking up from the pipe she was working on, and I made 2 cups and put one on the counter within her reach when she was ready for it, and she said thanks without looking up from the pipe. When she was done, she got up from the floor and tested the faucet, which did not drip, and she made a note on the work order and said, "Should be good now, let me know if it starts again." I said, "How long have you been doing this?" She said, "Fixing sinks?" I said, "Maintenance." She said, "Since I was about 16. My dad has 12 properties. I grew up doing this on weekends." I said, "Do you do it full time?" She said, "No, I'm an engineer, structural. I do the maintenance because my dad asks me to, and it keeps me sane to work with my hands on something that has a clear solution." I said, "As opposed to?" She said, "Most structural engineering problems take 18 months to identify and 3 years to solve. A sink takes 23 minutes. I said, "You timed it." She looked at me for the first time as though she was registering that I was a specific person rather than the resident she was doing a service for. She said, "I time everything." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because the most interesting thing about any task is the difference between how long you think it will take and how long it actually takes. That gap is where all the interesting information lives." I stood in my kitchen with my coffee and thought about that for a moment. She picked up her toolbox and the work order. She started toward the door. I said, "My name is Daniel, by the way." She said, "I know, it's on the work order." She said it without unkindness, just as a fact, and then she said, "I'm Layla," as though we had not already been introduced, which I understood as her way of doing the introduction properly, rather than the way I had done it by offering my name as an afterthought at the end of a service call. She opened the door and was about to leave, and then she said the thing. She said it over her shoulder, not looking at me, her hand on the doorframe, and she said, "My dad doesn't usually send me to the pretty ones." I did not say anything for approximately 3 seconds. Then I said, "Sorry?" She turned around. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just said something they had not planned to say, and is now in the process of understanding what they have said and deciding what to do about it. She said, "I shouldn't have said that." I said, "I'm not sure." She said, "What?" I said, "I'm not sure you shouldn't have said it." She looked at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize. Then she said, "I'm going to go." I said, "Okay." She left. The door closed. The faucet did not drip. I thought about it for the rest of Saturday. I thought about it the way you think about something when you are trying to decide what category it belongs to, whether it was a compliment or an embarrassment or a joke or an accident or some combination of all four that did not resolve into a single thing. What she had said was, "My dad doesn't usually send me to the pretty ones." Which was a statement about me that was also a statement about the situation, about the fact that she had been sent and what being sent might mean, and which had been said on the way out the door, in the way that people say things they have been thinking but were not planning to say, which is the most honest category of thing anyone ever says, and also the category most likely to cause embarrassment, both for the person who said it and the person who received it. I had not handled it particularly well. I had said I'm not sure, which was true, but was not a response so much as a holding position, a way of registering that I had heard it without committing to what I thought about having heard it. She had said she was going to go. She had gone. The sink was fixed. I left a message with the building management office on Monday morning. Not about the sink, which was fine. About a light in the hallway outside my apartment that had been flickering for several days, which was a real problem and not an invented one, though I will admit that I was aware, when I left the message, that it was the kind of small maintenance issue that might result in another call from the person who handled maintenance for her father's properties. I was aware that this awareness was operating in me while I left the message, and I chose not to examine it too closely. She did not come for the flickering light. A man came, older, presumably one of her father's other maintenance people, and he replaced the bulb in approximately 4 minutes and left without conversation. I went back to my life, which was teaching history to 16-year-olds and making my own coffee, and walking to the subway, and being, in the mild specific way that I had become since the end of the long relationship, content with the quietness of things. 3 weeks after the sink, on a Tuesday evening, I was grading papers at the kitchen table when someone knocked on my door. I opened it and Layla was standing in the hallway without a toolbox. She was wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt and dark trousers, and she had her hair down rather than pulled back the way it had been when she came to fix the sink, and she was holding a folder that appeared to be building documents of some kind. She said, "I'm doing my dad's annual inspection of the units. I need to check the smoke detector and the windows and the water pressure." I said, "It's Tuesday evening." She said, "I know." She paused. She said, "I also wanted to see if you wanted to get coffee." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Is the inspection real?" She said, "Yes." She said, "Both things are real. The inspection is real and so is the coffee." I said, "Separate things or the same thing?" She said, "Completely separate. The inspection takes about 15 minutes and then if you want to get coffee, we can get coffee. And if you don't, that's also fine." I said, "Come in." The inspection took 11 minutes. She tested the smoke detector, which worked. She checked the windows, which sealed. She ran the water and noted the pressure. She made notes in the folder with the specific economy of motion of someone who has done this many times. I made coffee, because I had been making coffee when she knocked and it seemed natural to continue. And when she finished the inspection, I poured 2 cups, and she sat down at the kitchen table, because I gestured at the chair and she took it. And we had coffee at my kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, and she told me about the project she was working on. A pedestrian bridge in the eastern part of the city that had a specific problem with its expansion joints that nobody had correctly identified yet, and I told her about the unit I was teaching, which was the First World War, and the specific problem of how to make a 100-year-old catastrophe feel immediate to 16-year-olds who were living in a world that had moved past it in every visible way. We talked for an hour. When she left, she said, "I'll let my dad know the unit is in good shape." I said, "I know." It was a reference to the sink conversation, to her saying she knew my name because it was on the work order. She recognized it. She smiled, which was the first time I had seen her smile, and went down the stairs. I want to tell you that what followed was simple and direct, and involved no further confusion about the nature of maintenance calls, but I am a history teacher, and I know that the accurate version is always more complicated than the simple version. What actually followed was, we got coffee the following Saturday, which she had suggested in a text she sent via the building management system, which was either the most indirect way anyone had ever asked me to get coffee, or a way of establishing that she was comfortable in both registers, the professional and the personal, and could navigate between them. The coffee was at a place she chose, near the university where she had done her structural engineering degree, and where she still occasionally taught a graduate seminar on load distribution, which I learned during the coffee, and which told me something about her that the toolbox had not told me, which was that she taught things because she wanted to, not because she had to, and that the teaching she chose to do was the most specific and technical thing she knew, which is the teaching that requires the most love for the subject. We had coffee for 2 hours. She asked about the First World War unit, and I asked about the bridge, and we talked about what it meant to explain complicated things to people who were encountering them for the first time, which was something we had in common, despite the fact that complicated historical catastrophes and complicated engineering failures are different categories of thing. She said, "What's the hardest part of teaching history?" I said, "Making people understand that the people who lived through it did not know how it was going to end. We always know how it ends. They didn't. The not knowing is the whole thing, and it's impossible to recover because the knowing is built into how we talk about the past." She looked at me for a moment and said, "That's exactly the problem with forensic engineering. You always know the building fell. You're trying to understand the decisions made by people who thought it wasn't going to." I said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." And then we talked for another 45 minutes about the phenomenology of knowing the ending and what it does to how you understand the middle and the beginning, and I thought about the long relationship that had ended with exhaustion and no longer surprising each other, and about what I might have understood differently about the middle of it if I had been able to read the ending from inside the middle, and I did not say any of that, because it was a first coffee and not a conversation for a first coffee, but I stored it. The second coffee was the following week. The third was the week after that. By the fourth, she did not need a reason to text, which is the specific threshold that matters in the early period of something that is becoming something, and which we had crossed without discussing it, which is how thresholds work when they are the right thresholds. She came to the apartment again on a Sunday afternoon in April to look at a window latch that had started to stick, which was a real problem, and after the window latch was fixed, we walked to the coffee place, and then walked further to the waterfront, and she talked about bridges, and I talked about history, and we walked for 2 hours, and when I said I was glad she had come to fix the sink, she said, "I almost sent someone else." I said, "What changed your mind?" She said, "I don't know. I usually do send someone else. I handle the more complex stuff and let the others handle the routine calls. A dripping faucet is about as routine as it gets." I said, "But you came." She said, "I came." I said, "Your dad doesn't usually send you to the pretty ones." She looked at me sideways. She said, "You remembered that exactly." I said, "It's a hard thing to forget." She said, "I said it before I knew I was going to say it." I said, "I know." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because of what you said after." She said, "What did I say after?" I said, "You said you shouldn't have said it." And someone who had planned to say something doesn't say afterward that they shouldn't have. She thought about this for a moment. She said, "You analyzed my sentence structure." I said, "I'm a history teacher. We analyze sources." She said, "I'm a source." I said, "You're a primary source." She said, "I've never been called that before." She said it with the smile, the one I had been seeing more often, and we walked along the waterfront in the April afternoon, and I thought about the 11 days the sink had been dripping, and the 2 maintenance messages, and the toolbox, and the work order, and the 23 minutes, and the things she had said on the way out the door, and everything that had come after it. And I thought that the gap between how long you think something will take and how long it actually takes is where all the interesting information lives, which she had said while timing her own sink repair, and which was also a description of the past several weeks, and which was, when I told her I had been thinking about it, something that made her laugh, the kind of laugh that means you have been thinking about it too. We have been together for 7 months now. She still does maintenance for her father's properties, which means she occasionally has to come to my apartment for a professional reason, and we have developed a system in which I try very hard to have actual maintenance issues and not to invent them, which is mostly working. Last month, the radiator made a sound I could not identify, and she came on a Thursday evening with a wrench and a look that suggested she already knew what it was going to be, which it was, and she fixed it in 16 minutes, and we had dinner afterward. Her father knows we are together, which she told him in March, a month into the coffees, and he said, "Is that why she has been taking all the calls on that building?" And she said, "No, she has been taking all the calls on that building because 3 of the units have had recurring issues with the heating system that require a professional," and her father said, "Right," and she said, "Also yes." He had apparently laughed and said he had not anticipated this when he assigned her to the property, and she had said, "Neither had I." He told her he was glad, and had then asked when she was going to fix the heating system properly, rather than doing individual calls, which is the way he expresses gladness, through practical questions. which she told me was consistent with who he was, and which I found immediately and specifically charming. She asked me recently whether I had invented the flickering hallway light, which I had left a message about the week after the sink, and which had been fixed by someone who was not her. I said, "The light was real." She said, "But you left the message because you thought I might come." I said, "The light was real." She said, "Daniel." I said, "The light was real, and I was aware, while leaving the message about the real light, that it was the kind of thing that might result in you coming, and I chose to leave the message about the real light rather than not leaving it, which is a distinction that I think matters even if it is a fine one." She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "That is the most carefully parsed sentence anyone has ever said to me about a light bulb." I said, "I teach history. Precision in sourcing matters." She said, "You treated your own behavior as a primary source." I said, "I'm trying to be accurate." She said, "You're trying not to admit you were hoping I'd come back." I said, "Both of those things are true simultaneously." She said, "I know." She said it in the way she says things she has thought about before she says them, directly and without ornamentation, and I thought about the first time she said, "I know," when I had said my name was Daniel on the way out the door, and she had said she knew because it was on the work order, and about the specific distance between that "I know" and this one, which was the distance of 7 months and 4 coffees that had become regular, and a waterfront walk in April, and a radiator on a Thursday, and a family dinner last month, where her father had asked me 3 precise questions about the First World War that turned out not to be small talk, but actual questions. And I thought that the gap between the first "I know" and the most recent one was exactly the kind of information that lives in the gap between how long you think something will take and how long it actually takes. It took a dripping faucet 11 days, and a toolbox and 23 minutes, and 1 sentence said on the way out the door. That was the beginning. The rest of it, which is ongoing, has taken the time it needed and is still taking the time it needs, which is the correct amount of time, which I know because I am a history teacher, and I know what the ending of a thing looks like, and this is not it. She texted me this morning while I was on my way to school. She said, "Your upstairs neighbor left a note with the building office about a slow drain. I'm going to be in the building at 11. Is your lunch break at 12:30 still?" I texted back, "Yes." She texted, "Good." I put my phone in my pocket and walked the rest of the way to school in the March morning, and thought about 11 months ago, when the sink had been dripping for 11 days, and I had left 2 maintenance messages, and a knock had come at the door, and about 23 minutes, and a toolbox, and a sentence said over a shoulder on the way out the door, and about primary sources and load distribution, and the phenomenology of knowing the ending, and the specific way she smiles when she has been thinking about something before she says it. And I thought that my father's landlord's daughter had been sent to fix my sink, and had said something she had not planned to say, and everything that followed had followed from that, which is either a love story or a maintenance report depending on how you look at it, and from where I am standing now it is both, which is the most accurate thing I can say about it, and accuracy, as I tell my students every year, is the beginning of understanding. I want to say something about the sentence itself, the one she said on the way out the door, because I have thought about it more than I have thought about most sentences anyone has ever said to me, and the thinking has produced something that I want to put down accurately. My dad doesn't usually send me to the pretty ones. The sentence has several layers that I have taught myself to identify because identifying layers in sources is what I do for a living. The first layer is the surface layer, which is, I find you attractive. The second layer is the situational layer, which is, I am aware that this situation has a power dynamic built into it, which is the dynamic of someone who provides a service and someone who receives it, and I am telling you that I notice this dynamic, and that my finding you attractive is operating inside it in a way that I am registering. The third layer, which is the one I have thought about most, is the layer about her father. She said my dad doesn't usually send me, which is not the same as saying I don't usually come. The active choice in the sentence is her father's. He doesn't usually send her to the pretty ones, which implies that sometimes he does, which implies a pattern of decision-making by her father that she is aware of and is commenting on. What she was saying was, my father made a choice that I notice, and that I am now naming to you. And in naming it, I am also telling you something about myself, which is that I came, which is a thing I am now telling you I chose to do inside a system that someone else set up. I had thought, when she said it, that she was embarrassed. I understand now, after 7 months of knowing how her mind works, that she was not embarrassed. She was being precise. She had said a precise thing in a form that sounded like an accident, but was actually an accurate description of a situation that she was thinking about clearly and choosing to name. She had said it on the way out the door because the way out the door is the correct place to say a thing you have decided to say, but that you want to give the recipient room to receive in their own time, because saying it on the way out means they do not have to respond immediately. They can respond later or not at all, and the choice is theirs. She had engineered the moment correctly, as an engineer would, which is to say, she had understood the load the sentence would carry, and placed it in the position in the structure that would let it be received without collapsing anything. This is the thing I would not have understood on the day she said it. I would have understood it as an accident, or an embarrassment, or a joke, one of the 4 categories I had originally proposed to myself. I understand it now as what it was, which is a structural decision made by a person who understood what she was building and was telling me, in the most precise way available, that she was building something and that it was up to me whether to build back. I told her this about a month ago. We were on the waterfront, which has become our place in the way that places become ours. And I told her I had been thinking about the sentence, and I told her my analysis of its 3 layers. She listened without interrupting, which is how she listens when she is interested in something. When I finished, she said, "The 3rd layer is right." I said, "What about the 1st and 2nd?" She said, "The 1st is obvious." I said, "And the 2nd?" She said, "You needed to know that I knew where we were standing." I said, "In the power dynamic." She said, "In the whole situation." I said, "And you wanted me to know that you had noticed the situation and were making a choice inside it." She said, "Yes." I said, "That's very precise." She said, "I told you. I time everything." I said, "You timed the sentence." She said, "I timed the whole morning." I said, "The 23 minutes was not accidental." She said, "It was accurate. I could have done it in 15, but I wanted to make sure the washer was seated properly." I said, "That's 7 additional minutes of time in my apartment." She said, "I know." I said, while I stood there making coffee. She said, "Yes." I said, "You gave yourself 7 extra minutes to decide." She looked at me. She said, "I gave you 7 extra minutes to make coffee." I said, "Is there a difference?" She said, "There's always a difference between what I'm doing and what you're observing me do." I said, "But they can be connected." She said, "They can be exactly connected." And she picked up her coffee and looked at the waterfront, and I thought about 7 minutes and a washer, and 23 minutes total, and 1 sentence at the door, and everything that had been built in the structure of those 23 minutes, by a person who knew exactly what she was doing, and had let me think it was happening spontaneously, which it was. It had just been thought about first, which is the correct order for things that are built to last. Her father called me last week. He called my cell phone, which he had from the building records, and he said, "This is Arash. I understand you teach history." I said, "Yes." He said, "I have a question about the Ottoman cadastral system as it relates to property inheritance in the early 20th century. I said, "I can probably help with that." He said, "Good." He asked his question, which was specific and well-researched, and suggested he had been thinking about it for a while, and I answered it as accurately as I could, which required me to say I'm not certain about the second part, and I'll look into it and get back to you, which I did the following day after looking into it. He said thank you. He said it the way he apparently says things he means, briefly and without elaboration. And then he said, "My daughter says you're a good teacher." I said, "She said that?" He said, "She said you know the difference between what people are doing and what other people observe them doing." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's unusual for a historian. Most historians confuse observation with fact." I said, "I try not to." He said, "Good. Let me know if the radiator gives you trouble again." I said I would. He hung up. I held the phone for a moment and thought about Layla, who had apparently told her father something about a conversation I thought had been private, and who had characterized it in a way that was also a description of herself, and who was, in everything she did, exactly the same person she had been when she arrived at my door with a toolbox and a work order, and had fixed my sink in 23 minutes, and said something on the way out that she had timed as carefully as everything else. I texted her, "Your father called me." She texted back, "I know." I texted, "You told him about the observation conversation." She texted, "I told him you were precise." I texted, "That was the Ottoman cadastral system call." She texted, "That was a test." I texted, "I figured." She texted, "You passed." I texted, "What was the test?" She texted, Whether you'd say you didn't know something you didn't know. I texted, instead of guessing. She texted, instead of guessing. I texted, I'm a historian. I know the difference between a source and a gap in the record. She texted back a single word, good, which is the word her father had used, and which I understood was the family's word for things that had been evaluated and found to be what they should be, and which was, coming from them, better than a more elaborate endorsement would have been, and which I am still thinking about, which is also good, which is how all the best things work. They give you something to keep thinking about, which means they keep being present, which means they are not finished, which means they are alive. She came at 11 today, as she had texted she would, for the upstairs neighbor's slow drain, which is a separate unit and a separate call. I was at school. She texted when she was done. Drain was roots from the tree on the east side. Told my dad we need to look at the east foundation too. I texted when. She texted, probably next month. I'll be in the building. I texted, lunch is at 12:30. She texted, I know. I read the text between classes, standing in the hallway of a high school that smells the way high schools smell, and sounds the way high schools sound, which is loud and slightly chaotic, and full of the specific energy of people who do not yet know how things are going to end. I teach them history because I believe that understanding how other people have not known is the closest we can get to understanding our own not knowing, which is the only thing that might help. I teach them to look at sources and ask what the source was doing, and what the observer was doing, and what the difference is between those two things. I teach them that the gap between the observation and the fact is where all the interesting information lives, which Leela said to me while timing a sink repair, and which I have started using with my students as though it is mine, which she would probably describe as citation without attribution, and which she would be right about. This year's First World War unit is going better than last year's. I changed the approach. Instead of starting with the assassination and the mobilization, I start by asking them what they would have needed to know in the summer of 1914, living in Europe, to have understood what was coming. And then I show them what people actually knew, and what they assumed, and what the gap between those two things produced. And then I show them what happened. The gap is where all the information is. The gap is where the story is. A sink dripping for 11 days, 2 maintenance messages. A woman who came when she usually sends someone else, and then said something on the way out that she had timed to the minute and placed in the structure exactly where it needed to be. The gap between what I observed and what she was doing. The gap between the first I know and the most recent one. 7 months of building something out of a 23-minute faucet repair and 1 sentence and a lot of coffee, and 1 waterfront and a bridge with bad expansion joints and a 100-year-old catastrophe, and a radiator, and a father who asks precise questions and says good when he means it, and a daughter who times everything and knows the difference between placing a washer correctly and the 7 minutes she gave herself to decide, which she would say were the same thing, and which I would say were connected, and we would both be right, which is the most accurate way I know to describe what we are and what we are building, which is ongoing, and which, from where I am standing, is going to be very good. The bell rang between 3rd and 4th period, and I put my phone in my pocket and went back into the classroom, where 22 16-year-olds were waiting to hear about the summer of 1914. I stood at the front and said, "Today we are going to talk about what people knew, and what they assumed, and what the difference between those two things produced." And someone in the 3rd row, a girl named Maya who asks better questions than most adults I know, said, "Is this about the assassination or about something else?" And I said, "Today it's about the assassination. But the principle applies to everything." She said, "Like what?" I said, "Like any situation where what you observe and what is actually happening are different things, and the gap between them is where all the information lives." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "That sounds personal." I said, "History is always personal. It is always people making decisions in the absence of the information that would have made the decisions easier, and then living with the results, and then other people studying the results long after everyone involved has stopped making decisions." She said, "So we're the people who study it after." I said, "Yes." She said, "That seems easier." I said, "It is easier, and it is also the source of every misunderstanding about history, which is that we know how it ends, and the people who lived it didn't. And the knowing makes us think they should have done things differently. And what we're actually looking at is people doing the best they could with what they had, which is what everyone is always doing." She wrote something in her notebook. The class continued. After school, I walked to the subway and thought about a primary source who said she doesn't usually come to the pretty ones, and about a toolbox and a work order and 23 minutes, and a sentence timed to land where it would give the recipient room to respond in their own time. And I thought that everyone is always doing the best they can with what they have, and that what she had was a wrench and a precise mind and 7 minutes and a sentence, and that what I had was a dripping faucet and the specific luck of 2 maintenance messages on the right days, and that the best either of us had done with what we had was to show up and pay attention, and let the gap between the observation and the fact be where the story started, which is where all the stories start, which is where this one started, 11 months ago, in a kitchen with a leaky faucet and a knock at the door.